Weissman for his leadership and his commitment, for his spiritual leadership and his community leadership, and it's wonderful to be with my colleagues in government. We travel in a posse. Legislator Jacobs and Assemblyman Levine, they work so hard on so many levels to protect our community, to improve the quality of life, but they always go above and beyond. I want to share something with you that Assemblyman Levine has been working on. I know that Legislator Jacobs has been involved in this as well. Tonight, many of my constituents, many of Legislator Jacobs and Assemblyman Levine's constituents will turn on the television. Most of them will not be breaking fast tonight. Most of them might not be breaking fast tonight. But they will turn on the television and they will tune into the Olympics in London. And they'll be watching the pageantry and the spectacle and the competition. What they won't be seeing at the Olympics is any remembrance of the massacre of Israeli athletes 40 years ago in the Munich Olympics. I led the Congress several weeks ago in sending a letter to the head of the International Olympic Committee asking for a moment of silence to commemorate that tragedy. Today is a day where we think about tragedy and talk about that more. 40 years ago, we were reminded of the historic persecution and anti-Semitism and terror that's been targeted at Jews around the world when 11 Israeli athletes were murdered. The response that my letter received from the head of the International Olympic Committee was, no, we're not going to have a moment of silence. On Thursday, just before I was scheduled to get on a plane and fly back to New York from Washington, I led several dozen of my colleagues in a bipartisan moment of silence under the dome of the Capitol. Now that's what we did in Washington, but Assemblyman Levine was instrumental in coordinating a moment of silence locally. That's going above and beyond. That is recognizing your leadership and making sure that people, whoever they are, wherever they're from, understand the importance of never forgetting. And so I want to thank the Assemblyman and the legislature for what they do every day to ensure that we never forget. Carrie Kessler is here. Carrie Kessler has never forgotten. He's the reason I'm here. Carrie is so persistent and so tenacious. He doesn't even take yes for an answer. He's the one who told me to be here at 5 o'clock when all the rest of you were told 5:30. Sitting out in the parking lot for half an hour. It's always the same. And I also want to recognize Ann Cohen, who I saw at an APAC event. Ann also, there you are, Ann also invited me. Ann was actually the person who gave us the first invitation to be with you this evening. Since it is Tisha B'Av, I want to begin by, not with, usually members of Congress or anybody in public speaking begin with a joke. This is not a time when we're celebratory. It's a time when we're contemplative. So I want to begin by sharing one point with you and then talk about some of the major challenges and threats we have. And I'll be very brief, maybe 15 to 18 minutes, and then take questions with the rabbi's consent. What we do here tonight on this fast day is easy to take for granted, but I want to remind you on why this is so important, what we do here, that we come to the shul with people from government and talk about what we need to do together. It is extraordinarily important and unique, ladies and gentlemen. It is unique in world history and in the Jewish experience. People have heard me say I will never pretend to be the smartest member of the United States Congress, although if you listen to some of my colleagues, you know the competition ain't that stiff. But no one, I say this immodestly, but nobody is as passionate a student of history, and particularly Jewish history, than I am. I study it, I pore over it. Most of the decisions I make are guided by what's happened in our own communal experience. And so I want to remind you of this, particularly as we sit here tonight at Young Israel of Plainview. For 1,721 years, from the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70 until the adoption of the Bill of Rights in the United States of America, no Jew could do what we're doing right here tonight. Nobody. No Jew had citizenship equal to that of his or her neighbors. No Jew was entirely free or secure or safe for 1,721 years. We were kicked out of England in the year 1290. We were expelled from France in the year 1306. And in about 10 days, on August 8th, 10 days from now or so, 9 days, we are going to be celebrating Columbus's voyage from Spain to the New World. He left on August 8th, 1492. So that's 516 years. 516 years ago, Christopher Columbus leaves Spain and comes to the New World, finds America. What most people don't remember is that there were a lot of Jews on his ships. You know why? Because August 8th, 1492 was the legal deadline by which, if you were Jewish under the Spanish Inquisition, you either had to convert or leave. August 8th, 1492. You either convert or leave. But you cannot be a Jew in Spain. And then what happens? 1789, the adoption of the Bill of Rights. And what does it say? It says, welcome home. You're living in a country where you know better, you know worse than anybody else here. You have the right to agree, you have the right to disagree, you have the right to remain silent. You want to have a synagogue, go ahead, open up a synagogue. As long as you pay your dues, we're okay with that. You know, think about this, folks. In the old days, where my grandparents came from, and I'm going to talk about them, where my grandparents came from, in Russia, when the government officials showed up, it was to watch the synagogue burn down. It wasn't to listen to a government official talk about our future together. So that's what we have in this country. That I can come with you, with Legislator Jacobs and Senator Levine, and talk about our obligation to each other. Protected by this experience, so don't take it for granted. Let me make a few points on some policy, and then take some questions. One of my proudest moments was when Israel's ambassador to the United States, Michael Warren, who himself is a historian, came to Long Island 2 years ago, went to the Shelter Rock Jewish Center, stood up on the bema and said, Israel has no better friend in the United States Congress than Israel. The Congressman. I love hearing that. That gave you a lot of knowledge to hear that. Here's the deal. I don't care whether it's President Bush or President Obama, I've always had one standard. When I agree with the president, I will support the president's decisions. When I disagree with the president, I will let the president know that I disagree. Doesn't matter who the president is. I've had some very strong disagreements with President Obama on the issue of settlements in Israel. I was quoted in the Jerusalem Post. The Jerusalem Post, when the president formulated his policy on settlements, I was quoted publicly criticizing the president for those positions on settlements. My view is very simple. Palestinians don't like Israel's policy on settlements, then negotiate. They don't like Israel's policies on building permits for settlements, then negotiate. They don't like it, they have a grievance with something that Israel is doing on settlements, show up and negotiate. The fact of the matter is that the Palestinians, the Palestinian Authority, have failed to negotiate. And Israel should not be asked to negotiate against itself. For 11 months, Israel was waiting at the negotiating table, waiting for Abu Mazen, the Palestinian Authority, to come and talk about their concerns and see if a settlement could be arrived at. And for 11 months, the Palestinian Authority and Abu Mazen refused even to show up. And so I said to the president, you can't ask Israel to negotiate against itself on the issue of settlements. And I think that our policy should have been more supportive of the Israeli government's position that there are no preconditions, everything's on the table, possessions. So their track record is demonstrated to the Palestinians. The Palestinians can't get anywhere by refusing to show up. Let me shift and talk about what I think is one of the greatest threats that we have. And I say we. I'm talking about Iran. It is not a threat to Israel alone. It is not a threat to the Middle East. The regime in Iran is a threat to all of us. To all of us. It is not Israel's problem. It is a world problem. We'll talk a little bit about that, and I'll tell you about something good that's going on, and then I'll wrap up. The rabbi was right. When I was invited to participate in a celebration of Israel's independence, I was in Israel at the time. I visit Israel as often as I can. My thinking on Iran was crystallized during one trip, and I know that Assemblyman Levine and Legislator Jacobs have heard me talk about this, so I apologize that I'll sit through it again. In 2005, I led, or I didn't lead it, but I helped to organize one of the largest AIPAC delegations of members of Congress ever to visit Israel. 28 members of Congress went to Israel. And it's one of the best things that AIPAC does is it brings members of Congress to Israel to see for themselves. And when we went, it was at, remember this, well, of course you remember this, the suicide bombings. So many suicide bombings that year. There had been a spate of suicide bombings. Almost on a daily basis, another discotheque, another bus stop, another restaurant, another catering hall. Towards the end of our trip, we met with Israel's defense minister at the time, whose name is Shaul Mofaz. He was the defense minister at the time. He had just joined, by the way, several months ago, Bibi Netanyahu's coalition government, and just pulled out last week. Shaul Mofaz was the defense minister, and he was born in Iran, Persian Jew. And now he's serving as the person in charge, entrusted with Israel's survival, security, and stability. So we're sitting at his conference table, 28 members of Congress. You can imagine 28 members of Congress with egos and opinions. It kind of sounds like a synagogue. Every single member of Congress was asking Shaul Mofaz about suicide bombings. What are you doing about suicide bombings? How do you stop suicide bombings? What kind of intel do you need for suicide bombings? What kind of logistical chain do